and it does speak in ancient time. I walk upon England's mountains green.
A very British podcast.
Benvenuti alla 26esima puntata di A Very British Podcast, il podcast che racconta il Regno Unito. Io sono Domenico Cerabona.
E io sono Federico D'Ambrosio. Oggi è una puntata un po' speciale, come spesso accade siamo riusciti ad avere un grande ospite, questa volta forse il più grande che abbiamo ottenuto finora, che è appunto, come avete visto nella descrizione, Jeremy Corbyn in persona. Questo è un momento abbastanza bello, è stato un momento abbastanza bello per me e Domenico, per tutti quelli che hanno partecipato insieme a noi quando siamo andati a fare la campagna elettorale del 2019 per lui, però è anche un'occasione molto, molto interessante per parlare di quello che ha fatto prima e dopo la sua leadership.
Sì, abbiamo parlato del suo progetto, il sito si chiama corbynproject.com, ma è una fondazione che si chiama Justice and Peace, quindi abbiamo parlato di quello che ha fatto nell'ultimo anno e mezzo, da quando sostanzialmente si è dimesso da leader del Partito Laburista. Abbiamo parlato un po' del passato, presente e futuro di Jeremy Corbyn e diciamo della sinistra laburista. È stata una bellissima occasione, come ascolterete è stata un'intervista molto semplice tra virgolette, perché ci ha messo a nostro agio e siamo riusciti a sostanzialmente a fare una chiacchierata con lui su quello che sta accadendo nel Regno Unito. Ci teniamo a ringraziare Francesca Nottola, che è stata fondamentale per riuscire ad avere un contatto diretto con Jeremy Corbyn e con il suo staff per riuscire a concordare questa intervista, e ringraziamo anche Roberto Volpe, che ci ha aiutato a preparare le domande insieme a Cosimo Serpolla e Pietro Moroni, che sono i nostri compagni di scorribande nel Regno Unito, ma anche e soprattutto con cui io e Federico ci confrontiamo quotidianamente sul Regno Unito, che ci danno sempre una mano nelle analisi in quella che noi chiamiamo la brigata Giolitti, che diciamo è fondamentale per questo podcast e per il nostro canale.
L'intervista è ovviamente in inglese, abbiamo deciso di non farci un doppiaggio sopra, che è ben al di là delle nostre capacità e non sarebbe venuto nemmeno molto un bel risultato, però troverete l'intervista su Left di questa settimana, il link è nella descrizione, tradotta in italiano.
Buon ascolto. So we are here very, very humbled to record our first podcast in English, and you will know why, because we have the honor to have Jeremy Corbyn with us, and we are very lucky to have him on and to have a chance to chat with him. And so I'm of course Domenico Cerabona
and Federico D'Ambrosio,
and very, very welcome Mr. Jeremy Corbyn. Hi.
Well, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be on this call, and thank you for the earlier tutorial you've just given me into the structure of Italian politics. It was brilliant and very brief, very to the point. Thank you very much. You should market it.
It takes a few hours for a real tutorial on all the details.
Well, the real tutorial's an hour, is it? It was lovely. Thank you very much.
So we would like to begin asking you, what have you done after you stepped down as leader of the Labour Party? Because we know you kept yourself very, very busy. So we would like to start from there. What have you done in this year and a half?
Well, thanks very much. After the sad results of the election in December 2019, and thanks to yourself and many, many others who came and gave us such fantastic comradeship, help and support. It really was appreciated, all the people that came from all over to help us. My leadership of the Labour Party then continued until April of 2020, and that was interesting because that led into the COVID period, and as soon as COVID became apparent through the World Health Organization, I appointed an emergency subcommittee of my shadow cabinet. John McDonnell led the charge on the question of furlough and supporting for workers. John Ashworth led the charge on vaccination, isolation, and all the issues that were so very important. And we actually, I think, performed very effectively in that period up until April. I was also very keen that the politics of the manifestos of 2017 and 2019 should not be lost. Essentially, the need for the left across the world to realize that management economics doesn't cut it, doesn't motivate or mobilize people. And then what's really happening is, as Bernie Sanders has so well articulated, is that we have a redistribution of power and wealth all in the wrong direction. And so our essentially redistributive manifestos were the basis of what we were doing and what I continue to do. I then thought for a long time with other people about setting up an institute or a project, and we eventually decided to set up the project for Justice and Peace, whose office I'm in at the present time. And we set that up as a way of promoting the policies of the two manifestos, of providing a political home for people, whether they're in the Labour Party or not, and to become a community-based and focused organisation. In other words, picking up the great work done by the community organising unit of the Labour Party with the massive membership that we had when I was leader. When I stood down as leader, there were 600,000 members, the largest political party in Europe, I think. The Project Peace and Justice has about 50,000 people signed up to it. And we have regular but very small contributions from a lot of people, which ensure that we can pay for the office and pay for the basic running costs of the organisation. And we've set ourselves 4 policy areas to work on, and they're all absolutely crucial and essential. One is media reform, media ownership, media access. And next Monday, we're doing a big event at the People's History in Manchester, in Piccadilly Gardens. We're doing an event on media ownership and the power of Murdoch, and I'll be in discussion with Gary Young, formerly of The Guardian, about the power of media to decide and direct our lives, and also the power it has over elections and political campaigns, both in this country and in the USA. And to do this, we've set up news clubs around the country, where local people come together on a news club to look at news issues, reporting, news values, and local campaigns and local issues. And we're setting those up all the time. They're all over the country. We've got about 20 so far, but they're growing very fast. Second area and third area are economy and environment, and they're of course completely linked. We're working with the Climate Change Coalition, working with all the other organisations, and the whole principle behind our project is we're not trying to take over other organisations, we're trying to work with people. And so we are working with campaigns for union recognition, Uber riders, Deliveroo riders, all those gig economy marginalised groups that work on 0 hours contracts or sometimes no contract at all, and support their right to join a union and above all their collective action. So we support them, we support union recognition campaigns, and we're supporting food co-ops and clothing co-ops around the country as a way of empowering people who are often in quite desperate need. And that is obviously something that takes up a huge amount of effort and work and is growing very fast. And in Britain, there are now more food banks than there are branches of McDonald's in the whole country. It's an astonishing fact. But linked to that, of course, is the Green Industrial Revolution and COP26 and the climate change issues, and how you deal with a new industrial revolution. If you think back to previous industrial revolutions, the steam revolution, the electricity revolution, the information technology revolution, all of those enriched and empowered the already rich and powerful. And big business became more powerful, global corporations became more powerful, and the poorest people suffered. And in the climate crisis, it's the poorest people that eat the worst food, breathe the worst air, and have the shortest life expectancies all over the world. And the climate crisis is here and it's real. And so the whole strategy we put forward in the two general elections, but particularly in 2019, was a green industrial revolution that invests in a community energy projects. And so we strengthen the community participation in this, and also challenge the destruction of the natural world and destruction of so much of our biodiversity. So we worked incredibly hard on all of those issues, and we'll be part of the big demonstrations. Indeed, I was with the young persons demonstration last week, and we'll be in Glasgow for COP26, joining in all the parallel events to the main event, in which hopefully we'll be giving voice to those communities in Britain, in Europe and around the world who would otherwise not be heard. And the last area is one of international solidarity. And Britain, like other countries in Europe, but Britain to a greater degree, has increased arms expenditure by £24 billion over the next 4 years, increased the number of nuclear warheads up to 280, and ignoring the legal requirements of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and absolutely refusing to join in the Global Ban Treaty on Nuclear Weapons. So we're very much part of the peace and anti-war movement. Indeed, I used to be chair of Stop the War Coalition. I've now been promoted to being a president of the Stop the War Coalition, and I'm very happy to be so. And I think this is the area of debate. What is security? What is security? Is security the strength of our armed forces and the ability to take out and kill and destroy people, have the biggest drones, the biggest bombs, the biggest weapons, the biggest surveillance? Or is security your food, your water, your health, your education, your housing, your land? And I think we all know the answer to that. And so that then begs the question of how you deal with trade, how you redistribute power and wealth during the era of transitioning to sustainable living. And do you carry on with a free market model, or do you develop something very different, a more socialist model, which is guaranteeing the basic living standards of everybody in our society? And so our solidarity actions globally have been working with people in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Mexico, in Canada, on election observation and issues, particularly in Bolivia and Peru and Ecuador, and solidarity with the Indian farmers. We've done a lot of contact with them and with the trade unions in Myanmar, and raising money to support the trade unions in Myanmar, as well as the refugee crisis. And I'll finish on this point, that the refugee crisis is here, it's real. There are 70 million people around the world who are refugees. That's more than the population of Britain. It's kind of more or less the population of each of the larger European countries. And they're all human beings, yet their treatment is disgusting and disgraceful. And the history books of the 21st century are not going to be kind to the coldness of the European and American politicians that set their face against the refugees. And I was on a call this morning with the Council of Europe. I'm a member of the Council of Europe, about refugee attitudes and how people are treated across the continent. So we do need that solidarity of supporting refugees. And in reality, the European dimension on it, I know the newspapers and the media in Europe wouldn't agree with me, but the numbers of refugees and asylum seekers in Europe as a whole is actually very small compared to the global number. Bangladesh, a large but poor country with very limited infrastructure. It was born out of struggle in 1971 with no infrastructure, government and political infrastructure worth speaking of at that time. And it has developed since then. But it's hosting 1 million Rohingya refugees, 1 million refugees in one country. And those refugee camps in Bangladesh look awfully like the Palestinian refugee camps of 1948. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope they get to return home. And I hope there is obviously political change in Myanmar, which means the Rohingya people will be respected and allowed to live their lives in peace and get on with it. But the refugee issue around the world is massive. And so I was concerned that on the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention, we were going to get too much grandstanding and self-congratulation. And so we organised a global refugee discussion group and had 10,000 people on it. It's quite hard to have a discussion with 10,000 people, but at least we managed to give voices to refugees in camps around the world or in refugee communities around the world. Our whole point is giving voice to those that wouldn't otherwise get it. And so it's exciting, and I'm doing a lot of work on that. Other things I'm doing are campaigning against fire and rehire, which is where companies in Britain dismiss their entire workforce and then offer them the same job back, except they've got to work longer hours for less pay and worse conditions, i.e. shorter holidays, longer hours and lower pensions. It's utterly disgusting. We have legislation we're bringing to Parliament on October the 22nd, which hopefully will make progress on making it illegal, but that is some way off. So we're supporting the many industrial actions that are taking place on fire and rehire. So we're doing an awful lot of travelling around the country to everywhere really, doing these support things. And last week we were at, earlier this week, the Labour Party conference in Brighton, where I was doing one big rally every night throughout the conference. Probably many of the same people came to all the rallies, I don't know. But it was interesting that at the conference, whilst the new leader of the party, Sir Keir Starmer, did get some, but not all of the rule changes he wanted through, he did not succeed in blocking the policy demands in the party on £15 an hour minimum wage, on the rights of Palestinian people and opposing the occupation of Palestine by Israel, and a very strong endorsement of the Green Industrial Revolution, the Green New Deal that we put forward. So I've been actually as busy as I've ever been. And I either do lots of it on Zoom from this office or my constituency office just down the road or my home. And now that travelling is much easier, we're doing a lot of travelling. So I spend a vast amount of time on trains. It's a good thing I like train travel.
So basically, both the government and the new leader of Labour were elected on different premises. Then COVID arrived and changed the politics. How do you feel COVID has affected British and also international politics?
I think all the arguments that I put in the 2019 election about the need to deal with the social injustices and inequalities by public investment through public investment banks, which is something you've had in Italy for 50 years or more. The principle of a substantially funded public bank, and we were going to develop them as regional banks to help reduce the regional inequalities in Britain, which are enormous. They're probably as big as the regional inequalities in Italy. We also demanded public ownership of mail, rail, water and energy. We also demanded free access to internet for every household in the country on the basis of a universal postal service. Why not universal internet access? It's how, after all, most people communicate with each other. And obviously a fully publicly owned and publicly run NHS and care service. I was told by many who should have known better that this was all too expensive. But in reality, it would only be bringing Britain up to somewhere around the midpoint of most social expenditure across Western Europe. And indeed, a Swedish journalist came and interviewed me, and he said he'd heard about this really extreme program we're putting forward. Could I explain it? And so I did. And he said, "Oh, is that all?" And he said, "Well, this is all pretty normal stuff in Scandinavia." I said, "Exactly. That's how far neoliberal economics has gone in Britain ever since Thatcher." And that's why we're doing it. But fundamentally, it was about challenging and transferring power. But the point about COVID is that the government was forced into supporting furlough, forced into supporting companies in order to get through this pandemic, and forced into funding the NHS. Where I completely part company with them is that, yes, put the money in, but in return, take equity in those companies that we're putting money into. In return, take over the now huge private health system in Britain and make it part of the National Health Service, because there is a crisis of demand in the NHS at the moment. And also ensure that companies that put their workers on furlough took them all back at the end of it. There were no job guarantees attached to it, and many workers are now finding they're actually losing their jobs, and the companies are using it as a chance to get rid of large numbers of workers and then employ them again on worse conditions, fire and rehire. And so we would have obviously done things very differently. But I think what it's done is change public attitudes towards what the role of government and society actually is. It's also changed a lot of attitudes of people within our own community. I mean, you know this as well as I, that a lot of people volunteered in mutual aid groups in our country, where we're supporting food banks, mental health support, clothing exchanges, all kinds of things that very needy families rely on to get through. And the volunteers that have come into the mutual aid groups, it's changed their lives and changed their outlook. They didn't realize they were living next door to people who are actually desperately poor and desperately in need of the food that the rest of us are donating. And I think it's that generation, not just in Britain, but all across Europe and America, who are going to see the world in a slightly different way after all of this. And so I think that's been one effect. The other has been the way in which Big Pharma has made a lot of money out of the vaccinations. Now, the vaccinations, of course, are necessary and so on, but the intellectual property should be in common ownership. In common ownership, probably the World Health Organization would make sense. But instead, we have public money going into the research for the vaccines, and there are numbers of vaccines broadly having a similar process and effect, all of which have been publicly funded, yet the patents remain in private hands. And so I'm one of those that's been demanding that the intellectual property rights on the vaccines be handed over to WHO at no cost, and therefore all of the vaccines can become generic vaccines all over the world. At the moment, we have vaccine discrimination big time. Poorer countries getting none, the poorest people in even middle-income countries not getting much, is simply wrong.
Do you think that this crisis will generate a reaction like after the Second World War, where we had, especially in Britain, you with the Attlee government changed everything about the welfare state and so on. So that crisis changed the social concept of all over Europe and the West. Or you think there's a risk that something like 2008, after that the bank were saved, and then we had the austerity as a reaction. So do you think which direction this crisis will take?
Well, after 2008, the banks and the bankers were all saved, and the rest of the society paid the price. And so we had the bank bailouts all over. We then had the austerity imposed in the case of countries in the Eurozone by the European Central Bank, in the case of Britain by the Bank of England, and the US by the Federal Reserve. It's the politics of the madhouse, really, and the economics of the madhouse, because if you make those cuts, you automatically hit the poorest and most vulnerable. You automatically hit those that rely on Social Security to survive. You automatically reduce the spending power in the economy, so you actually lead to a big downturn. It's just an absurd policy. Now, post-COVID, initially, the argument of the government was, it was as though Rishi Sunak, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer economics minister, it was like he had sort of gone to bed and woken up as a Keynesian economist and would come to Parliament and talk about the need to unleash public expenditure to get through and rebuild. And now, a year on, they're cutting the expenditure to local government. Local government is 80% funded by central government in Britain, and it is a major deliverer of public services. So obviously, many services are hit as a result of that. Social services, education, housing services, mental health, and so on. And then by restricting the money into the NHS, they actually force the privatisation of NHS services. And those NHS services then go over to often multinational companies. So when I warned in the general election that Boris Johnson had a plan for American healthcare to take over the NHS, he sort of dismissed the whole thing and said, that's ridiculous. It's poppycock was the words he used. And we then discover not many months later that everything I said was true. If anything, I understated the case rather than overstated it. So will it lead to a 1940s reaction? To some extent, yes, in that there is now a greater acceptance and understanding of how vital publicly owned health and social care and social services are. And I think there's a greater understanding of the role of the public sector in delivering those services. But it does mean that the left have got to be strong, determined, but also to explain and understand what's going on and make the demands. The attitudes have to also be empowering people. The difference between what we were putting into our manifestos in 17 and 19 with 1945 was that the Attlee governments basically created a number of huge state enterprises, National Coal Board, for example, and all the other industries and services that were taken into public ownership, all run on a national state level where the government appointed the board of directors and they became the management employers and so on. In a sense, as though you're creating a public monopoly and you appoint the board of directors to it. I mean, I could see why he did that at the time, because he was desperate to get things moving quickly. But I was not really following that model at all. I was following a model of democratic control of the industries. So Royal Mail, which has the universal postal obligation in it to be able to deliver letter or parcel to every house in the country every day, or 6 days a week, would have management of it come from consumers, from the union, from the management itself, and it would be empowered on that in exactly the same way the railway system and others. So we'd bring in a much more democratic form of public ownership. And that the regional investment banks, the national investment banks, where they put money into a private sector company, and they may well need to do that at times, that would be accompanied by a public involvement in it. So we would be expanding the public interest in the economy quite greatly in a number of ways, not all through complete public ownership, in some cases by investment, but with a public payback in it. And so that was the difference in that structure. Is there a thirst for all of this? I believe there is. And I believe the love that people have for the National Health Service, and that is very true and very genuine in this country, has changed attitudes to a lot of other things. And people genuinely do value the National Health Service. Sometimes they don't realise how much of it is delivered by the private sector, but when they do realise it and the campaigns take place, the support for them is enormous. So I think there is a change in approach and attitude. There's also, I think, an understanding that if we're to deal with the environmental crisis, you can't do it all through free markets. It has to be about consumption levels, it has to be about income guarantees, and it has to be about information and technology sharing all across the world. There's no point in Italy, Britain, France, or Germany having the most amazingly sustainable green economic strategy if we're doing absolutely nothing about pollution that's coming from elsewhere, or indeed exporting our pollution by not manufacturing goods ourselves that are from polluting industries, but importing them from somewhere that doesn't have any regulation at all. So it is a global thinking, and that's why the community discussions and solidarity meetings in Glasgow in November are going to actually be very important.
So we wanted also to ask you what, so we talk a bit about history here, and mostly British history, and we were also curious what was your relationship with the Italian history, the history of the workers' movement and the left in general in Italy. You've been in politics for quite some time, and we were curious what was your relationship with Italians and the Italian left.
Well, I believe very much in international solidarity movements, and I'm fascinated by the debate that happens in every country between the national interest and the international solidarity interest. And there was a very interesting article in the Morning Star last 10 days ago about the left in Britain and its attitude towards war and intervention. And when I saw the title of the article, I thought, yeah, that's interesting, I'll read that. And I assumed it was going to start with the huge pan-European debate before the First World War, of the left saying we won't go to war because we have no problem with workers in Germany or France or Italy. We actually have a common interest as workers. But in fact, in the case of Britain, it goes back to 1861, when Britain was, a bit later, 1884, I think. Yeah, 1884, when Britain was involved in occupying Sudan and had sent General Gordon to Khartoum to basically establish it as virtually a British colony. Anyway, it didn't work out very well for General Gordon, and he didn't operate terribly well, and he ended up being besieged. And then word got out of the terrible situation General Gordon was in, and then whether or not a relief force should be sent to go and enable him to be saved. And there was a public debate about it. Some of the left said, well, he's British and it's in British interest, so we've got to go there and save him. Others said he was part of a colonial endeavour and he shouldn't have been there in the first place, and neither should anybody else be there. First big public debate about imperialism and solidarity. Anyway, an expeditionary force was sent to try and save General Gordon. It was too late, he was already dead, but they brought his body back. The same year, the Congress of Berlin, when all the European countries, with America as an observer, sat around a big table in Berlin and carved up Africa. Hence the straight lines on the map in Africa that bear no relationship to language, identity, ethnicity, or anything else. And Britain, like Italy, like France, like Germany, like the Netherlands, the working class movement was always divided between international solidarity with colonial peoples, as they were then called, or solidarity with the ruling class and their endeavour. And that, in a sense, became the huge divergence on the First World War. Taking it forward a bit, after the First World War, there was the growth of international solidarity movements, partly through the Comintern and the role the Soviet Union played in that, but also with the two other internationals that came along, the Second International and the Fourth International, all of which had ostensibly the same objectives. And so that sense of solidarity is, to me, very, very important. And I've been in the Labour Party all my life, and we've been through these debates. And my great friend, the late Tony Benn, and the late Fenner Brockway founded the movement for colonial freedom in the 1950s, at a time when Britain was involved in some appalling activities in opposing the independence movement in Kenya and in Malaya, and in Guyana and other places around the world, and committed what would now be war crimes against those people. Tony and others set up the movement for colonial freedom as a solidarity movement, and Vindabhai Gopal's book on the anti-colonial struggle and solidarity movements is absolutely fascinating in chronicling all of this. Our contacts with the left across the European continent have been, as with everything else, affected by the Cold War from the 1940s onwards, between the Communist Party and communist-inclined political forces, which have never been electorally particularly big or successful in Britain, because the Labour Party has tended to dominate that space. Not to say they haven't had some successes, but they've always been very powerful in the trade unions and in left intellectual circles. So there's been that link up with the Italian left, both at the Communist Party level and at the Socialist Party level. Now, at the Socialist Party, Labour Party level, that has often been, in the case of the unions, through the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and the Communist Bloc through the World Federation of Trade Unions. And that persisted all the way through to the end of the Cold War in 1990. And it was before I was born, but there's the apocryphal stories told about the 1948 election in Italy, with that actually technically quite brilliant but absurd poster of a worker going to vote with being watched over by Stalin and the Virgin Mary. And the legend is that Stalin doesn't know how you vote, but God does.
That's a true one.
And that was a seminal election in Italian history. And yes, we've had great contacts with wonderful comrades in Italy, and I've got fond memories of attending popular fiestas in the late summer, early autumn in Italy. And what I love about the Italian style and culture is you do everything outside, and you do everything accompanied by food and wine. I mean, I don't drink, but I like other people to enjoy themselves. And that's what I think how we do our politics should much more be a cultural thing, which is why I've always spent a lot of time promoting cultural activities within the left. So you do music, you do art, you do poetry, you do imagination. And indeed, some of the great poets historically were also the great inventors, because the mind that can write poetry can also write equations.
Actually, we have so many questions to ask, because we followed you since the starting of your campaign in 2015, because we were very excited about your platform. So it's like an interview that we would like to do for since then. So
I'm sorry you had to wait so long.
Talking about you always talk a lot about young people and young generation, and that's maybe is one of the most fascinating thing about your campaign and your movement, because you were able to empower a lot of young people throughout your leadership campaign, and especially during the election in 2017 and 2019. The under 35 voted for Labour in like never before. But it is a very great problem in Italy, because it's quite the opposite, because the left has a quite old electorate, and it's very tough for the left to speak to young generation which voted for Movimento 5 Stelle in 2018, and now they are fascinated by the far right. So how you were able to empower those young generations?
Well, young people are getting a really rough deal. Generally, all across Europe, all across America, they're getting a really rough deal. In the case of our country, a young person in their 20s, 40 to 50% of whom will have been to college or university, will have debts of around 40, 50,000 pounds, a bit more in euros. And they will probably be living in private rented accommodation, which is very expensive. Rents in London are, for a very small flat, £300 a week. And so probably more than half their income is going on rent. They will be working often on 0 hours or insecure work, and they will not be guaranteed sufficient sick pay or a pension at the end of it. And they will be under pressure to help fund their parents' social care when they get older. And their parents, if you're talking to people in their 20s or 30s, their parents' generation who thought they were moving into a period of middle-age security will find that at two ends they're having to pay for their parents' social care and they're having to pay for their children's university education. And so what we're seeing is a massive pressure being put on young people, which is why I was under a lot of pressure not to do it within the Labour Party and many others. I said, no, we're not going to mess about on university fees. We're going to end them altogether, finish them, and go back to the principle of universal free education as a human right, same as the health service. Cradle to grave education. Education is free in primary, secondary, and to some extent in college, and to a considerable extent at nursery level. I wanted to make the nursery age down to 2, with also support for under 2-year-old childcare, because the early years are so important, but also refund adult education as well. And this, yes, was it going to be expensive? Yeah, of course it was going to be expensive, but it seemed to me absolutely the right thing to do and invest in. And we put that in both manifestos. And it had an electrifying effect on young people, even those that hadn't gone to college, because they could see that we were actually serious about young people's opportunities and also the guarantee of skill training, apprenticeships for those that didn't go to college or university, or a bit of both, because there's no reason why there shouldn't be both. And so it was about a manifesto for young people. But here's an idea. Why not the left across Europe and across America agree on a minimal manifesto for young people? A manifesto we can campaign on around free education, access to healthcare, right to travel, right to study. And I was also keen on expanding the education opportunities of studying in other countries. We have the Erasmus scheme across Europe, which needs to be much bigger. And I wanted to introduce the idea of students routinely doing one of their 3 years at university in another country. That will help to bring greater international understanding. All of those things are so important, but it's also about young people and housing, it's young people and youth clubs, it's young people and police attitudes towards them in every society. It's about empowering young people. And I'm old enough to be able to say all that. And so we put all that into both of our manifestos, and I'm so grateful for the hundreds of thousands of young people that supported us and indeed still do in our campaigning work, and that's what the PJP is focused on.
Yeah, we've seen in at the Labour conference that you were greeted with the famous chant of Jeremy Corbyn in lots of events. So a quick follow up about that. Did you ever expect the Glastonbury moments? You know, the pop moment, the singing, all where young people were.
The Glastonbury thing was quite incredible. I know Michael Eavis, who's founded Glastonbury, and he's a great guy, lovely guy. And he invited me. My office was incredibly excited about it. I think they were more excited about the chance of getting tickets to go to Glastonbury than anything else. And suddenly everybody wanted to work on a Saturday and Sunday to come with me to Glastonbury. Like everybody he'd ever seen was phoning up saying they'd be happy to come along to Glastonbury with me. we thought about it, and obviously I agreed to go. And various people sort of thought of what I should say and speeches that I should give and so on. And then about 20 minutes before I was due to go on stage, I decided I didn't like what we talked about at all, and didn't like the idea of the outline of the speech that had been given to me. So I scrapped it and wrote another one in my notebook, in this kind of notebook, sitting on a stool behind the stage, and then gave the message I did and ended with the wonderful words of Shelley, who was, of course, half Italian in his outlook on life, and indeed died in Italy. And Shelley, from the wonderful poem, The Mask of Anarchy, which is about the power of the state in Manchester in 1820 to kill people who were standing up for their political rights. So it was an incredible moment to go there to Glastonbury. And then afterwards, because my time was quite restricted on the stage, and Michael said to me as I went on, he said, say what you like, do what you like, but don't be longer than 9 minutes. I said, what happens if I'm longer than 9 minutes? He says, I come and grab you by the neck and take you off the stage. I said, well, that'll be good television. Anyway, I did my best to stick to it. I then went to the left field of Glastonbury afterwards, and then we had a very interesting, quite long discussion about the nature of political power and culture that goes with it. Because I think the left are often too inward-looking and don't realise that a lot of people are motivated by music, by art, by theatre, and by ideas. And social media can be a horrible, horrible place. Tell me about it, I know. It can also be a place where you can put out a lot of great ideas and great information. And so it's something we've got to work with and work around. And so it was an amazing experience. And that evening I went to Exeter and had a vegan dinner with my niece who lives there.
So there's a question that you probably get a lot, which is, to give, a balance, an outlook on your leadership. But I wanted to ask you something a bit different, because we know that you didn't wait to become Labour leader to start doing important things from the backbenches. So we're curious about what is something that we don't know about, that's not very known, that you were able to do to get during your leadership that you're very proud of?
Well, I think there's two things I'd say to that. One is that after the 2015 election, the left in the Labour Party, like lots of other people, lots of discussions. Why didn't we win? Why didn't we win the election after 5 years of austerity under the coalition government? And my view, and that of John McDonnell and others, was that Labour had essentially offered to carry on with the austerity economics. There were some good stuff in the manifesto 2015, but underneath it all, it was a continuation of the public sector wage freeze and the freeze on benefits and all the misery that was getting worse and worse, and particularly the attacks on people with disabilities. And so I was of the view we should challenge. Most people said, don't. We won't even get on the ballot paper. It's not worth it. All we'll do is expose our weakness. And I said, well, what's the point of being here if we don't challenge now? And so we did. And I was asked by the Socialist Campaign Group to be the candidate. And we then got campaigning, and because of the support of young people in the party and around the country, we were able to create a huge social media presence, which was enough to encourage 36 Labour MPs to nominate me. Many of whom didn't support me, but felt that I ought to be on the ballot paper. And I'm grateful to them for that, because at least they showed the maturity of saying, well, actually, you do have a right to be on the ballot paper. And we then mounted a campaign So the success was mounting the campaign and building a campaign up from nothing. When we started, we had absolutely nothing at all. And within a week, we'd set a good campaign up. And within a month, we had a whole team working. We had offices and we had teams all over the country and regional campaigns and city campaigns, national campaigns in Scotland and Wales and so on. And as you know, we won the election. The thing that I think is most important was I was under attack from the very beginning, from the right wing of the Labour Party and the right wing in the Labour movement, and from the British media. And so I was treated to the vilification by the British media like nobody else has since Arthur Scargill, the leader of the Mine Workers Union in the 1980s. And they then faced a coup within the party less than a year later, and we won the second election by even more than we'd won the first one. And I think the big achievement was to change the political debate on the economy, to change the political debate on environment, to change the political debate on international solidarity. And I'm proud of the achievements surrounding that. And we attracted large numbers of people into the Labour Party. And so at the time I stood down as leader after 2019 election, there were 600,000 members of the party. There were less than 200,000 when I first was nominated for leader.
Is there something like some small thing, something that didn't reach the news that you did that you're very proud of?
I think mobilizing people in communities who had often never been involved in politics before to get involved in the environment roundtables, the economic roundtables, and the empowerment of people. I'm so proud of that. And also the way in which our manifesto was put together, including the commitment to an arts and culture premium for every school child, as well as all the investment stuff. And also, I've been opposed to wars all my life. I've been part of the peace movement since I was in school. And I was obviously very opposed to the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. And I said, when I stood for leader, that if elected leader, I would give an apology for Labour's involvement in the Iraq war, and did so on the day that Sir John Chilcot's report came out on investigations into it. That was the day I was under maximum pressure from within the Parliamentary Labour Party and many others to not do it. They knew what I was going to do, and they said, terrible, awful thing to do. I said, no, it's got to be done, and I will do it. The other big moment after the horror of the Manchester bomb during the 2017 election, again, I was advised not to do this, was I said, we've got to say something about the effect of interventionist wars by mainly Britain and the USA have had on people around the world. I said, I'm obviously not condoning in any shape or form whatsoever what happened in Manchester, but you've got to reckon with what's happened around the world. So I made a speech about the effects of the war on terror. I was then had an avalanche of attacks on me for a few hours afterwards. And then an opinion poll was done by telephone, which showed that almost 60% of the population said what I said was sensible, true, and right. So I think we changed the debate on international politics, on economy, on environment, and of course, the role of young people in society. So it is about changing minds and activating people, and that's what I'm continuing to do.
In 2019 election, the Socialist Campaign Group, the left of the Labour Party, had increased its presence in the PLP, in the Parliamentary Labour Party, and so what do you think about those young people, this young generation that came in the Labour Party, and so you think now even if the left, especially in the Labour Party, is under huge pressure and attack, what do you think in the future? What's the future of the left in the Labour Party?
We now have 36 members of the Socialist Campaign Group in Parliament, and there's some wonderful young people in that new intake. Zara Sultana, Belle Ribeiro Addy, Marsha Cordova, Claudia Webb, and so on. Wonderful people, and more than half of the new intake are Black and minority ethnic women. And that was part of my policy on the way we should change the selection process for candidates to broaden the intake. Sadly, some very good comrades like Laura Smith, Laura Pedcock, Karen Lee, Selma Walker lost their seats in the election. So I was faced in 2015 with in practical terms, the genuine support of probably about less than 20 members of the Parliamentary Labour Party. So I had difficulties from the very beginning. It changed a bit as time went on. It changed a great deal after the 2017 general election, when a lot of good comrades were elected, and it changed again after 2019. But obviously, we didn't win the election, so the result was what it was. What's the future of the left? I think the left in the party is facing a lot of attacks. There are quite a lot of members been suspended. We're supporting them and fighting back on that, as many are doing. And the attendance at all the events we did at this year's Brighton conference was absolutely enormous. You'll have seen the photos of the Socialist Campaign Group rally on Tuesday evening. It was in a big tent at the World Transformed. That was totally full from an hour before we started. And then there were loads of people outside in the rain, listening to it as well. So, the support is there and is phenomenal. And so our campaigning work is with communities on fire and rehire, on opposing the cut in benefit universal credit, opposing the cut in disability allowances, demanding an increase in statutory sick pay, internationally in solidarity with refugees around the world. And I'm obviously very, very busy in lots of areas, and next month in October I'll be speaking to the International Peace Bureau in Barcelona, along with Lula from Brazil. I think he's coming virtually, but I'll be there physically as the opening session on this. So we look to a future alliance, and through Progressive International, through our work here, through the left and the Labour Party, it's all about the left having the confidence to make the arguments for socialism, for social justice. You cannot solve the climate crisis by getting into some bunker of nationalism, of xenophobia, of racism, and the faux attraction of the far right. So it is about defeating them. And whilst the elections in Germany have produced the result they have, the interesting part is that the Social Democrats went up quite a bit, the Greens went up quite a bit, Die Linke went down a bit, but are still strongly represented in the Bundestag. But the far right has gone down quite a lot. But it is about challenging the arguments of the far right. I know that's something so many comrades do every day in Italy, and you have my full solidarity and support, because the far right offer nothing other than hatred and division. And this Sunday I shall be in Cable Street in the East End of London, commemorating where 85 years ago the Jewish community and the Irish community occupied the streets to stop Mosley and the fascists marching through. It was a seminal moment in the political history of this country, and we'll be commemorating that on Sunday.
Well, so thank you for your time then.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
One last thing before we go. Can someone from Italy also help with the Peace and Justice Project? Or do you have an organization that you want to shout out?
Yes, of course, absolutely. Francesca already does. She gives a great deal of help and support to us. And yes, of course, we want to do link ups. We're very happy to join in with Zoom calls, meetings, conferences, and I'm more than happy to come to Italy if you wish me to visit. I'd be very happy to come because I do think it's about building building that sense of international solidarity when it matters. And we are linked up with people in Greece, and I'm going to Lesbos in the near future. I'm going to Spain, and I'm going to be in Mexico later in the year. My wife's from Mexico, as you probably know. So we do want to build that international solidarity because it's the only way forward. And of course, our work in Glasgow during COP26 is going to be promoting all of that international understanding. Behind our borders, in one country, we ain't going to solve all these problems. It's only collective action. And if our collective action is fettered because we end up in some nationalist place where we're incapable of expressing solidarity, we're all weaker.
Thanks a lot. It was a very inspiring and an absolute honor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, and thank Francesca for arranging it for us as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you again.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again.
Torniamo in italiano, questa è stata la nostra intervista con Jeremy Corbyn. Avrete sentito che per noi è stato abbastanza emozionante, lo seguiamo dal 2015, è anche stato, diciamo, la nostra porta di accesso a interessarci così tanto e così quotidianamente alla politica del Regno Unito. Come abbiamo detto, trovate una traduzione di un estratto dell'intervista su Left, il link lo trovate nella descrizione di questo podcast, insieme ai link della Fondazione Jeremy Corbyn, il Peace and Justice Project, che, come abbiamo chiesto e come ci ha detto, accetta anche gli italiani, se siete interessati.
Come al solito, per qualunque richiesta di informazione, suggerimenti, critiche, siamo a disposizione su info@fondazioneamendola.it e sul nostro canale Telegram A Very British Channel. Questo podcast è realizzato con il contributo della Fondazione Giorgio Amendola e di Left. Ringraziamo ancora Francesca Nottola, che è stata fondamentale per questa intervista, quindi grazie davvero. Io sono Domenico Cerabona.
E io sono Federico D'Ambrosio. Ciao!
Ciao!
A Very British Podcast.